Hey there history fans, and welcome to my final video on my series on the Viking Age. We've discussed a broad overview, culture, and context of the age, as well as the Scandinavian myths and the role of women in Scandinavian society. Now we talk about the topic of what I most treasure, and the topic I am most knowledgeable in, which is the Viking way of war, because first and foremost, I am a military historian. For over 3 centuries, the Scandinavians dominate Europe in strength of arms. In truth, the Viking Age and the Viking expansions began as raids and activities that imitated pirate practices. But soon, the Viking raids became full-scale military operations conducted by Viking sea kings in search of treasure, land, and resources. What's most strange is that, while a Viking army couldn't be effective without at least some form of strong leadership, there was no single ruler in any of the Scandinavian countries until very late in the age. In other words, this was one of the few times in history that a people conquered without the direct lordship of a brilliant commander. It was the Viking culture that bred such superb warriors. But why was the Viking way of war so effective? Well, in a way I've touched on this in various aspects in my other videos. We've already discussed how every man in Viking society was expected to know how to fight with his fellows, to be a strong physical combatant, to fight for his thane, and to fight to protect his home. They were not a culture that bred servants. There were no serfs or peasants, there were free men, proud people who lived in harsh conditions, making them hardy and stubborn. Their protein-rich diet and climate made them large, barrel-chested, and strong. Warfare was an aspect of the gods. In fact, it was the primary aspect of their greatest gods, and had been for thousands of years. Their chief god Odin was not only a god of war, but a god of rage and dying valiantly in battle, a god of wisdom and military strategy. Their previous head god was Tyr, another god of battle. They also had Thor, who was a god that was supposed to represent humanity and to be its protector, and he was also the god the giants and monsters most feared for his ferocious battle tendencies. Even Frigg, or Freyja, goddess of fertility, was a fierce fighter and a goddess of combat. Most of Europe's greatest enemies and greatest warrior influences originated in Scandinavia since the Roman times. War was in their blood, and they waged it violently. Scandinavians were expected to know how to be excellent hunters as well. Scandinavian men didn't have the avid archery tradition as late medieval England would, but they were still known to be accurate archers with the hunting bow they would often bring into battle, as well as being very skilled at the javelin. There were reports of Scandinavians fighting one another off the coast of Britain, throwing javelins at one another in longboats, and many were skilled and quick enough to catch javelins mid-flight and throw them back at their enemies. Now onto a contentious topic of Viking warfare, and that would be the melee weapons. Now, as a disclaimer, I'm going to be speaking about the weapons of the Scandinavians of the Viking Age, not the Viking Age in general. As many YouTube history buffs would tell you, the most popular main weapon of any army of antiquity and the medieval era was the spear, and the sword was almost always a sidearm and secondary weapon. And they aren't wrong. Spears are easier to make, they have reach, and you can use them against cavalry charges. However, Vikings did not use the spear as often as most armies back then, and I would argue that they used a combination of swords and axes with shields as much, if not more, than the spear. Not to say that the spear was not a popular weapon. Hell, Odin's main weapon was a spear. However, there was no shortage of swords in Viking society, as they were prized and sought-after weapons that denoted wealth and status. We've also found various digs that had hoards of swords dated back to that age in Scandinavia. Not only did the Vikings make swords well, and not only did they take swords from their fallen enemies, because it's much easier to take something than make it, but Vikings were also avid trading partners of various cities in mainland Europe that were large sword manufacturers. And even though trading weapons with the Scandinavians was banned under the rule of Frankish kings, that did not stop people from doing so. That, and axes, were very popular. Axes with a shield were just as effective as a spear or a sword and a shield. The shields would detract against a spear's reach advantage, and the axes and swords up close were easier to wield. Axes were also easy to produce and lethal in combat, not that spears were wholly cumbersome if you used both hands. But still, swords and axes were much easier to carry around, and a Viking without a shield was also a Viking who was somewhat vulnerable to ranged warfare. That, and it would be hard to transport spears across longboats and carry them across countrysides. So the Vikings, while they did use the spear, also used swords and axes quite a bit. But let's stop speaking on weapons, or in such general terms of warfare. Let's discuss just how Vikings waged war. Firstly, they often had surprise on their side because they had the brilliantly designed longboat. The construction of the ship, as well as the skill in which they sailed, gave them complete naval superiority of the Northern Atlantic and European river systems for the entire age. They could slip in from the sea, and because of how shallow the boat was and how low it could ride in the water, it could be beached virtually anywhere. It was also portable for a group of 6 Vikings or more, so a Viking raiding party or army could strike from anywhere at any time. Though all this aside, even if the Vikings were masters at surprise attack and were better trained than the majority of their western and eastern counterparts, that would still be far-fetched for these barbarians to be so good at open warfare. Some might think that what they lacked compared to others was strategy and tactics. Well, you would be mistaken. The Vikings were very adept at group cohesion and discipline, as well as demoralizing their opponents. They often used a tactic that they credit to Odin for teaching them, which was the wedge formation that helped them halt charges. What Scandinavian warriors would often do would be to create a large shield wall and taunt their opponents into attacking them, shouting and cursing at them, maybe sometimes making a fake charge to draw them in. Then their enemies would attack, in which the Vikings would hold firm and break the enemy on their shields. When their enemies would fall back in disarray, then the Vikings would begin butchering, and the berserkers and warriors could run down the fleeing enemy and hack them to pieces. And on the off chance that the enemy didn't break, or they were not taunted, that would simply leave the enemy in a war of attrition against the Scandinavians, and such warriors did not break under pressure in battle, and more often than not, led to Viking victories regardless. I highly suggest you research the Great Heathen Army and its conquest of England, because it showcases every strength the Vikings brought to bear on the battlefield. I also recommend this channel History with Hilbert because he gives great videos on this. But I'll give a brief description here, however, to showcase how effective they were. Ragnar Lothbrok was one of the most successful Viking sea kings of the age, and the first great Viking conqueror of mainland Europe. When he went to England, he was captured and thrown into a snake pit by the king of Northumbria, King Aella. At this point in the mid-9th century, Northumbria was the center of culture and trade in England. The king of East Anglia invited Ragnar's sons Ivar and Halfdane and their army to England as they sought revenge for their father's death, as well as booty and land. The Scandinavians attacked Northumbria, destroyed its army, and Ragnar's sons got a hold of King Aella, performing a blood eagle on him. I described this in a previous video, but it was a right to Odin, as Scandinavians often used their enemies as sacrifices to the gods. A blood eagle was one of the more gruesome sacrifices. You cut open a man's chest and yank away their ribs, and then you pull out their lungs and flip them over their shoulders, and the lungs have a grisly resemblance of wings. If the pain or trauma does not already kill you, you drown in your own blood. The king that invited the Vikings to England after they performed the Blood Eagle on King Aella then told them to go, but he was in no position to order them around. They liked England too much, and there was much land and resources to take. They conquered his kingdom next, captured him, tied him to a tree, and shot him full of arrows. Then the Vikings conquered every other kingdom in England except Wessex, who was under King Ethelred II, a capable commander who unfortunately died after a year of fighting from complications, which means that the Vikings conquered 4 out of the 5 English kingdoms. Who succeeded King Ethelred was his unlikely younger brother, who we now know as Alfred the Great, the founder of modern England and one of the inspirations for King Arthur, and even he could not defeat the Vikings in open combat. The best he could ever get was a stalemate, and causing the Vikings to leave the campaign because he made war too costly, and he paid them to leave through a tribute payment called Dangald. Alfred's best quality was that he never gave up, and he was always ready to raise more armies. And most would have, for the Vikings still thrashed him many times. They also performed a maneuver that Vikings often did to surprise enemies that could put up a good fight, and to any other army it would seem a suicidal tactic, and that was to perform a winter campaign, as the winters in mainland Europe and even Britain were easy to handle compared to the harsh cold and lack of resources in Scandinavia. So, I know that was somewhat of a short video, and if anyone wants anything expanded upon, let me know, but let's review. What made the Vikings such an indomitable force was a combination of culture, myth, and even biology, a hard land that bred hard people, where they were superb with the bow, the javelin, the sword, the axe, and the spear. A culture that had been waging war for thousands of years, and a society that bred self-sufficient, free men whose citizen soldiers had more in common with the Roman Republic's warrior ethos than all of Rome's Frankish descendants. So, thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you again soon. Have a good day.